anniversary dinner without me. My phone vibrated for the 7th time. Where are you? Mom is furious. Don't embarrass me tonight. I stared at the screen, then looked back at the elderly man sitting in my truck. His breathing had finally slowed after the panic attack that had nearly sent him crashing into a roadside barrier. If helping him made me late, I'd make the same choice again. I had no idea that decision would expose 11 years of lies, destroy a family's pride, and change my life forever. If you've ever been judged because of your job, your background, or the size of your bank account, you're in the right place. Hit that like button, subscribe, and stay until the end, because today's story proves that kindness always keeps the receipts, and arrogance always pays the bill. My name is Nathan Brooks. I'm 38 years old and own a small mobile repair business that fixes heavy machinery across the state. It isn't glamorous work. My boots are usually covered in grease. My hands carry tiny scars from years of honest labor. But every bill in my house had always been paid. Every promise I'd ever made to my wife had been kept. Unfortunately, none of that mattered to her mother. Victoria Lawson had spent more than a decade convincing anyone who would listen that her daughter had married beneath her. According to Victoria, successful men wore expensive suits, drove imported sports cars, and discussed investments over 200 bottles of wine. I drove a work truck filled with tools. To her, that made me invisible. Every Christmas dinner came with another insult disguised as polite conversation. Still repairing machines? When will you find a real career? Our daughter deserved someone with ambition. I smiled through every comment, not because they didn't hurt. Because I loved my wife Emma, she squeezed my hand beneath every dinner table, silently apologizing for words she never spoke herself. I kept telling myself patience was stronger than anger, that one day they would see the truth. I couldn't have been more wrong, because on one rainy Saturday evening, a stranger stranded on the roadside would unknowingly hand me the opportunity that fate had been preparing for years. And before that night was over, my mother-in-law would discover that the man she had spent 11 years looking down on was the only person capable of saving everything she valued. The drive to Sterling Manor should have taken 30 minutes. It took almost an hour. The elderly man, his name was Arthur Whitmore, kept apologizing from the passenger seat, insisting he would be fine if I simply dropped him at the nearest service station. "I'm only slowing you down, son." "You aren't," I replied. "People matter more than schedules." He studied me quietly, as if weighing those words against a lifetime of experience. By the time I left him safely at a private medical clinic where a doctor was already waiting, my shirt sleeves were wrinkled. My polished shoes were splashed with muddy water, and my phone displayed 12 missed calls. 9 from Emma, 3 from her mother. I already knew how the evening would begin. What I didn't know was how it would end. When I finally walked into Sterling Manor, conversations softened. Crystal chandeliers reflected off marble floors polished so perfectly I could almost see my own exhausted face staring back. The maitre d' looked me up and down before forcing a professional smile. "The Lawson party is expecting you." Expecting, not welcoming. As I approached the private dining room, I could already hear Victoria's unmistakable voice. "I told Emma years ago that love doesn't pay the bills." The room erupted in polite laughter. Then I stepped inside. Silence. Emma stood first, relief washing across her face. "Nathan." Victoria didn't even try to hide her disappointment. "How thoughtful of you to arrive," she said, checking her designer watch. "We were beginning to think you'd forgotten proper manners." I stopped to help someone. Her lips curled into a smile that carried no warmth. "Of course you did." Her husband, Richard Lawson, remained focused on his wineglass. He rarely defended me. He rarely disagreed with his wife. Their daughter Olivia, Emma's younger sister, offered me an apologetic smile before looking away. I took my seat. The dinner continued. Or rather, the interrogation began. "So," Victoria asked loudly enough for everyone to hear, "how's the little repair business?" "It's doing well." "Well enough?" "Yes," she nodded slowly. "That's nice." There it was. That single word. Nice, the word she used whenever she wanted to remind everyone that she believed I would never belong in their world. She turned to another guest. "Olivia's fiancé is joining an international investment firm next month." Everyone applauded. "And Nathan," she continued, "fixes broken machines." More polite laughter. I smiled, not because it was funny, because I refused to give her the reaction she had chased for 11 years. Inside, though, every insult landed like another stone in a backpack I had carried for far too long. Emma reached beneath the table and squeezed my hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I squeezed back. "It's not your fault." But deep down, for the first time, I wasn't sure that was true anymore. Because silence protects the guilty almost as much as the people speaking the insults. And somewhere across the city, Arthur Whitmore was making a phone call that neither the Lawson family nor I could possibly imagine. A single call that would quietly begin turning the entire balance of power upside down. The next 3 days passed in complete silence. Not from Victoria. From Arthur. I hadn't expected to hear from him again. To me, he was simply an elderly stranger who had needed help on a rainy afternoon. I'd done what anyone with a conscience should have done and moved on with life. Or at least, I tried to. Monday morning began like every other. My mechanics were already rolling tool carts across the concrete floor. Air compressors hissed. Impact wrenches echoed through the workshop. The familiar smell of engine oil and hot metal filled the air. This was my world. Honest work. Honest people. Around 10 o'clock, my receptionist walked into the garage looking unusually nervous. "Nathan, yeah? There's someone here asking for you." I wiped the grease from my hands and walked toward the office. Waiting outside was a black luxury sedan. Not expensive. Extraordinary, a sharply dressed woman stepped out first. Behind her, Arthur Gone were the wrinkled clothes and tired expression from the roadside. Today he wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, polished shoes, and carried himself with quiet authority. He smiled. "I hope I'm not interrupting." I blinked. "Arthur?" He laughed softly. "I clean up better than I did on Saturday." Before I could answer, the woman beside him extended her hand. "Rebecca Collins." I shook it. "I'm Mr. Whitmore's executive assistant." "Executive assistant?" Something didn't add up. Arthur noticed the confusion on my face. "I owe you an explanation." He looked around the workshop, watching my employees carefully repairing engines, rather than pretending to work because the owner was nearby. "They respect you. I try to earn it." He nodded, almost to himself. "I thought you might." He gestured toward a nearby calf. "Would you give an old man 30 minutes? Over coffee, Arthur finally told me the truth. He wasn't retired. He wasn't struggling financially. And he certainly hadn't been traveling alone by accident. Arthur Whitmore was the founder and chairman of Whitmore Industrial Holdings, one of the country's largest engineering and infrastructure companies. For over 40 years, his business had acquired manufacturing plants, logistics firms, and commercial developments worth hundreds of millions of pounds. I nearly dropped my coffee. I had no idea. "I know. Why didn't you tell me?" He smiled. "Because then you would have helped the businessman." He leaned forward. "I wanted to know whether someone would help the old man." Those words stayed with me. People often changed when they saw wealth. They became friendlier, more generous, more interested. Arthur had spent years hiding his identity to discover who people truly were. "You never asked my surname. You never offered it. And you never asked what helping me would get you." "I wasn't looking for anything." "I know." For several seconds he simply watched me. Then he placed a leather folder on the table. "My company is looking for an operational advisor." I frowned. "I repair machinery. You understand people. I'm not qualified. You understand integrity." I opened the folder. The consultancy fee alone was more money than my business earned in 6 months. My heartbeat quickened. "I can't accept this just because I changed a tire." Arthur smiled knowingly. "No." He paused. "You'll earn it." Then his expression became serious. "And Nathan, yes?" I recognized the surname Lawson the moment you mentioned your wife's family. A chill crept up my spine. Arthur slowly folded his hands. "They've been asking my company to finance a major commercial development for nearly a year." I stared at him. "You know my in-laws? I know their business." He paused again. And after what I witnessed at that dinner, his eyes hardened for the first time. "I know far more about their character than they realize." For the first time in 11 years, I realized fate hadn't simply given me an opportunity. It had handed me the truth. And the people who had spent years humiliating me had absolutely no idea that the quiet mechanic they mocked was about to become the one man standing between them and the biggest business deal of their lives. For the first time in 11 years, I wasn't the one walking into someone else's world. They were walking into mine. Arthur's offer sat on my desk for 2 days. Every time I looked at the folder, I heard Victoria's voice in the back of my mind. A mechanic will always be a mechanic. Some people simply aren't meant for bigger rooms. For years, I'd convinced myself her opinions didn't matter. That was a lie. Words don't disappear. They settle somewhere deep inside you, waiting for the day they're either proven true or completely destroyed. Emma found me staring at the contract late Tuesday evening. You've been reading the same page for 20 minutes, I smiled weakly. I'm wondering if I'm in over my head. She walked behind my chair, wrapped her arms around my shoulders, and rested her chin against my head. Nathan, yeah? You've spent 15 years solving problems nobody else could solve. Engines aren't billion-pound companies. No, she kissed my forehead. But people are still people. I looked up at her. What if I fail? Emma smiled. What if you don't? Thursday morning. Whitmore Industrial Holdings occupied the top 12 floors of a glass tower overlooking the city skyline. Everything inside screamed success. Marble floors, quiet elevators, art worth more than my house. Expensive suits moved through the lobby carrying leather briefcases instead of toolboxes. I suddenly became very aware of the calluses on my hands. Arthur noticed. Nervous? A little. Good, I looked at him. People who aren't nervous before important moments usually have dangerous levels of confidence. That made me laugh. It also helped. The boardroom overlooked half the city. Around the polished table sat lawyers, financial analysts, engineers, and senior executives. Most of them looked at me exactly the way Victoria always had. Who let the mechanic in? Arthur remained standing. Ladies and gentlemen, the room fell silent. This is Nathan Brooks. A few polite nods. Arthur continued. Last Saturday, this man delayed meeting his wealthy in-laws because he stopped to help an elderly stranger. Nobody reacted. They didn't know the story. He didn't know who I was. Now every eye was on me. He asked for no money. Still silence. He expected no reward. Arthur slowly walked around the room. For 43 years I've built companies. He looked directly at his executives. And I've learned one lesson that every spreadsheet eventually proves. He tapped the conference table. Character always outperforms charisma. Several people lowered their eyes. Arthur continued. Nathan will serve as my operational advisor during our evaluation of the Lawson development project. One executive immediately raised his hand. Sir. Arthur nodded. You have concerns? The executive hesitated. Mr. Brooks has no corporate background. Arthur smiled. No, but he has something that's becoming increasingly rare. The room waited. He knows the difference between making money, Arthur looked straight at me, and earning respect. No one argued again. Over the next 3 weeks I reviewed construction schedules, maintenance reports, supplier contracts, and staffing plans. Arthur wasn't interested only in profits. He wanted to know how people were treated, how suppliers were paid, how workers spoke when managers weren't listening. Slowly, a troubling pattern emerged. The Lawson Group looked impressive from the outside. Inside, corners had been cut, promises had been stretched. Employees feared speaking honestly. Managers manipulated reports to keep Victoria and Richard happy. Nothing illegal, but everything fragile. One afternoon, Arthur closed the final report. So, I took a deep breath. The project can succeed. He nodded once. But it needs honest leadership. Arthur folded his hands. I agree. Then he asked the question that changed everything. If you were me, he paused. Would you trust the Lawson family with hundreds of millions of pounds? The room became perfectly silent. Every person around the table stopped writing, stopped breathing, stopped moving. Because, my answer, would decide the future of the family that had spent 11 years convincing everyone I was worth nothing. No one spoke. 20 pairs of eyes remained fixed on me, waiting for an answer that would influence a deal worth hundreds of millions of pounds. Arthur didn't interrupt. He simply watched. He wanted the truth, not the answer he hoped to hear. I slowly folded my hands on the conference table. If I were investing my own money, I paused. I wouldn't trust them. The room became so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. Arthur nodded once. I was hoping you'd say that. Across the table, Rebecca closed her notebook. One of the company's legal advisors adjusted his glasses. So the investment is cancelled? Arthur leaned back in his chair. No. Every head turned toward him. It's being redesigned. He looked directly at me. And Nathan is going to help me do it. The following week, the Lawson family received an invitation. Not to celebrate. to negotiate. The meeting would take place at Whitmore Industrial Holdings headquarters. Richard Lawson arrived 20 minutes early. Victoria arrived 10 minutes later, dressed as though she were attending a royal gala rather than a business meeting. The moment she walked into the executive boardroom, her confidence filled the room. Then she saw me, standing beside Arthur, not at the visitors' chairs, at the head of the table. Her smile disappeared. "What is he doing here?" Arthur answered before I could. "Mr. Brooks is my operational advisor." Victoria forced a laugh. "I'm sorry. Surely there's been some misunderstanding." "There hasn't." Richard remained silent, though I noticed his face tighten. Arthur gestured toward the chairs. "Please." The meeting began. Charts appeared across the presentation screen. Financial forecasts, construction schedules, investment structures. Everything looked promising, until Arthur reached the final slide. A long list of operational failures, late supplier payments, poor maintenance planning, employee turnover, safety concerns, every issue supported by documents, every weakness impossible to deny. Richard slowly removed his glasses. Victoria's expression hardened. "Our competitors exaggerate these matters all the time." Arthur calmly shook his head. "These reports came from your own managers." Silence. Victoria turned towards me. "You supplied this?" "I verified it." "You've spent years pretending to be part of this family only to sabotage us?" For the first time in 11 years, I didn't lower my eyes. I didn't sabotage anyone. I spoke quietly. "You ignored the truth long before I ever walked into this room." Victoria laughed bitterly. "Coming from a mechanic?" Arthur interrupted. "Coming from the only man in this process who never lied to me." The words landed like thunder. Victoria looked at Arthur in disbelief. "You trust him more than us?" Arthur answered without hesitation. "Yes, why?" "Because character cannot be manufactured." He looked directly at her. "It reveals itself." The room fell silent again. Richard slowly exhaled. He finally spoke. "What happens now?" Arthur slid a revised contract across the polished table. "The investment remains available." Hope briefly returned to Victoria's face. Then Arthur continued. "Under new conditions." She opened the document. Her expression changed with every page. Independent financial oversight, mandatory operational audits, employee protection policies, performance milestones, complete transparency, and one final clause highlighted in bold. Nathan Brooks would oversee operational compliance throughout the entire project. Victoria slammed the contract shut. "This is humiliating." Arthur remained perfectly calm. "No." He folded his hands. "This is accountability." Victoria stood abruptly. "I will never allow that man to supervise my company." Arthur looked at Richard. "Then there is no investment." Richard stared at the contract for several long seconds. Then he did something no one expected. He looked at his wife and quietly said, "Sign it." Victoria turned towards him in absolute disbelief. "Richard." He shook his head. "No." His voice was tired. "We've spent years judging the wrong person." He glanced at me. The only man who actually earned everyone's respect was the one we kept insulting. Victoria looked around the room. No one defended her. Not Richard. Not the lawyers. Not the executives. For the first time in her life, she stood completely alone. And in that crushing silence, she finally realized that the empire she believed she controlled was no longer hers to command. It belonged to the truth she had spent 11 years trying to bury. Victoria didn't sign the contract. She threw the leather folder across the polished conference table. It skidded to a stop directly in front of Arthur. "I won't be blackmailed." Arthur didn't even look down. "This isn't blackmail." His voice remained calm. "It's the consequences of your own decisions." The room was silent. Victoria looked around, expecting anyone to defend her. No one moved. Richard stared at the table. The attorneys avoided eye contact. The executives suddenly found their notes fascinating. For the first time in decades, her authority meant nothing. She stormed out of the boardroom, her heels echoing through the corridor. The heavy door slammed shut. The sound lingered. Richard remained seated. He rubbed both hands over his face before letting out a slow, exhausted breath. "I should have stopped her years ago." Arthur studied him for a moment. Yes, there was no anger, no sarcasm, just truth. Richard nodded, accepting the weight of those words. He looked at me. "Nathan," I met his eyes. "I'm sorry." Two simple words, words I'd waited 11 years to hear. But something inside me surprised me. They didn't erase the memories. They didn't erase the holidays ruined by insults. They didn't erase watching Emma cry after family dinners. Some wounds don't disappear because someone finally admits they caused them. I appreciate the apology, I said quietly. But forgiveness isn't a business agreement. Richard lowered his head. I understand. Arthur stood and gathered the papers. The offer remains available. Richard looked up. Even after this? Arthur nodded. Your company deserves a chance. Then he looked directly at Richard. Whether your family deserves one is another question. Over the following months, everything changed. The Lawson Group underwent a complete transformation. Managers who ignored employees were replaced. Outstanding supplier invoices were finally paid. Safety standards improved. For the first time, workers were encouraged to speak honestly without fear of retaliation. Whenever I visited project sites, people treated me with genuine respect, not because Arthur had given me authority. Because I listened. Because I remembered what it felt like to be ignored. One afternoon, a construction foreman approached me. You know, he smiled. We've worked for the Lawsons for nearly 15 years. I nodded. This is the first time anyone from management has ever asked what we actually think. His words stayed with me. Leadership wasn't about having the loudest voice. It was about hearing the quiet ones. Emma noticed the change too. Not in my career. In me. You smile more now. She said one evening as we sat on our back patio watching the sunset. I suppose I do. You don't come home carrying them anymore. Them? She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. The insults. I looked down at our joined hands. For years I'd carried every cruel comment like another brick on my shoulders. Now, the weight was gone. Not because Victoria had changed. Because I had stopped giving her permission to define my worth. A week before Christmas, there was an unexpected knock at our front door. Emma answered it. Standing on the porch, alone, was Victoria. She looked different. No designer confidence. No icy smile. No superiority. Just a tired woman holding a small wrapped gift. Emma froze. So, Victoria said softly, May I come in? Emma looked at me. I slowly walked to the doorway. For several seconds, no one spoke. Finally, Victoria lowered her eyes. I spent 11 years believing money measured a man's value. Her voice trembled. I've never been more wrong. She looked directly at me. I can't undo what I said. No, I can't ask you to forget. You can't. A tear escaped down her cheek. Then let me ask for something smaller. I waited. A chance to become someone my grandson won't be ashamed of. For the first time since we'd met, Victoria wasn't asking for control. She was asking for grace. And that was a decision only I could make. The greatest revenge had never been destroying her reputation. It had been becoming a man whose character she could no longer deny. Victoria stood on our front porch with tears in her eyes, clutching a small gift as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. For 11 years she'd walked into every room believing she was the most important person there. Now she stood on my doorstep, waiting for permission to enter. I looked at Emma. She looked back at me, silently asking the same question that echoed through my mind. Can people really change? After a long moment, I stepped aside. You can come in. Victoria entered slowly, her confident stride replaced by hesitant steps. She glanced around our modest home, the family photos on the walls, Trevor's school drawings on the refrigerator, the smell of fresh cookies drifting from the kitchen. For years she'd called this life ordinary. Now it looked like something she had never truly understood. Trevor came running down the hallway. Grandma. Without hesitation, he wrapped his arms around her. Victoria broke. Tears streamed down her face as she hugged her grandson tighter than she'd ever hugged anyone. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I've wasted so many years. That evening, no one talked about money. No one mentioned business deals. No one spoke about prestige or status. Instead, we talked about birthdays that had been missed emotionally, holidays overshadowed by pride, and memories that deserved better. Richard finally looked at me. I spent too much of my life keeping the peace instead of doing what was right. I nodded. Silence always has a price. He lowered his eyes. And everyone eventually pays it. For the first time in our relationship, there were no walls between us. Not because the past had disappeared, but because the truth had finally replaced it. 6 months later, the Whitmore project had become one of the most successful developments in the company's history. Arthur kept his promise. He made me a permanent strategic operations advisor while I continued running my repair business. The consultancy transformed my company. We expanded to 3 new locations, hired more apprentices, created scholarship programs for young mechanics who couldn't afford technical training. Every opportunity I received became an opportunity for someone else. One afternoon, Arthur stopped by the workshop. He watched a teenage apprentice helping an elderly customer change a damaged wheel outside the garage. Arthur smiled. "You've started something." I shrugged. "They're just helping." "No." He looked at me proudly. "They're following your example." That meant more to me than every check I'd ever received. Because businesses make money, character builds legacies. Nearly a year after that rainy afternoon, Emma and I attended another family dinner. Same hotel, same dining room, same family. But everything had changed. This time, Victoria stood as soon as we entered. She walked across the room and hugged me. "I'm glad you're here." No sarcasm. No hidden insult. Just sincerity. She turned to the guests and smiled. "I'd like everyone to meet my son-in-law." She paused. "The finest man I've ever had the privilege of knowing." The room applauded. I smiled politely. Not because I needed their approval anymore, because I no longer needed anyone's approval. The greatest revenge was never making Victoria feel small. It was refusing to become the bitter man she expected me to be. She spent 11 years trying to convince the world I had no value. One act of kindness proved otherwise. I didn't win because I became richer. I won because I never let someone else's arrogance change who I was. And that's the thing about karma. It rarely arrives with anger. It arrives quietly, right after you've chosen to do the right thing when no one is watching. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit the like button. Subscribe to Dad's Cold Revenge and turn on notifications so you never miss another unforgettable revenge story. Share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think is the best kind of revenge? Success, forgiveness, or simply living well? Until next time, remember, the strongest revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's becoming someone they can never look down on again.